The problem with leftist judges is that they don't base their decision on the Constitution. So when they're making their rulings, they're not relying on the law as written or precedent. Instead, they're relying on modern sensibilities to come to all of their conclusions. And that's exactly what we see today, called out by Senator Josh Hawley in glorious fashion against Biden-era nominee Julia Kobick. But before we get to this clip, don't forget to like and comment on this video so we can break through the algorithms. Here we go.
Ms. Kobick, if I could just start with you. Let me ask you a question about the First Amendment, if I could. Does the First Amendment apply to the medium of the internet, in your view?
My understanding is that it does, Senator.
Why would that be true, considering that the internet didn't exist in 1791?
Well, Senator, the Supreme Court has adopted a number of different tests for assessing the constitutionality of different provisions. The First Amendment protects speech, of course, and people speak on the internet. But I would adhere to the relevant test if any First Amendment case were to come before me.
Well, I ask you because the Supreme Court has said something much the same in the Second Amendment context. And in the Second Amendment context, you argued to the Supreme Court that because a particular firearm did not exist at the time of that amendment's ratification, that it wasn't covered. The Supreme Court, covered by the right, that is, the Supreme Court rejected your opinion unanimously in a per curiam opinion. That's the Catano case. I've got it right here. You've been asked about it. You know, what's interesting to me about this case is there's a lot of division on the United States Supreme Court about a lot of topics, including the Second Amendment, but they were unanimous in this case. It's a very short order, 2 pages, not even, really, page and a half, in which they rejected your argument completely out of hand. And I just want to ask you, why did you make an argument that the Supreme Court said held no water at all, so much so that they felt the need to address it in a per curiam decision and to remand the case, saying that the arguments that you made were not to be countenance at all? You didn't get a single vote. So tell me, help me understand, why did you make arguments that the Supreme Court said had previously been made and previously rejected by the same court?
Thank you, Senator. I just would like to clarify at the outset that I did not handle the Catano case when it was before the Supreme Judicial Court. The case was handled by the district attorney rather than the Attorney General's office at that stage. In the Supreme Court, the argument that I made—
Wait a minute, you didn't, the Catano case at the U.S. Supreme Court, you didn't handle it?
I did co-author the brief in opposition to certiorari at the Supreme Court,
Okay,
but not the Supreme Judicial Court.
I'm asking you about the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court judgment that rejected your arguments. So you've just confirmed, I think, that you made those arguments to the United States Supreme Court. Is that correct?
Respectfully, Senator, the argument in that brief was slightly different. The argument was that a stun gun is, we argued on behalf of the Commonwealth, not an analog to a founding era weapon. Which
the Supreme Court rejected unanimously.
The Supreme Court held that the Supreme Judicial Court had misstated the Heller decision in 3 respects. But again, I didn't handle the case in front of the Supreme Judicial Court.
So your argument is that your position wasn't rejected unanimously by the U.S. Supreme Court?
I certainly acknowledge, Senator, that the Supreme Court summarily reversed the Supreme Judicial Court's decision. And I would adhere to the Supreme Court's holding in Catano and reaffirmance of Heller's statements.
Here's what I'm trying to understand. The Supreme Court was very dismissive of your arguments. One of the reasons it was dismissive is it said they've considered these arguments before and rejected them. This is why they then rejected your arguments per curiam, unanimously. So I'm trying to understand why someone who has ethical obligations to the court, why you would make arguments that the court has previously rejected, knowing that they'd previously rejected them. And then here's the other thing that interests me. In this case, the person who had been arrested under this law that the Supreme Court then reversed on was the victim of domestic abuse. And I just want to read a few of the facts here. This is from Justice Thomas and Justice Alito's concurrence in that per curiam judgment. Here's what they say. After a bad altercation, that's from the trial record, with an abusive boyfriend that put her in the hospital, Jamie Catano found herself homeless and in fear of her life. So she obtained multiple restraining orders against her abuser, but they proved futile. So when a friend offered her a stun gun for self-defense against her former boyfriend, she accepted the weapon. And it's a good thing she did. Because one night, after leaving work, Catano found her ex-boyfriend waiting for her outside. He started screaming that she was, this is from the trial record, not gonna effing work at this place anymore because she should be home with the kids they had together. Gitano's abuser towered over her by nearly a foot and outweighed her by close to 100 pounds. She stood her ground, displayed the stun gun, and announced, "I'm not going to take this anymore. I don't want to have to use the stun gun on you, but if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to have to." And the gambit worked. The ex-boyfriend got scared, and he left her alone. You think she shouldn't have had the right to self-defense?
Senator, thank you. Again, the district attorney made the decision to bring charges in the Gitano case. The Attorney General's office and myself were not involved in that decision, but I certainly recognize
that you argued for it to be upheld before the United States Supreme Court.
Senator, the argument in that brief was that the Supreme Court should deny review of the case.
Right,
but
which deny the right of self-defense to this person. I'm asking you why.
Senator, my duty as Assistant Attorney General was to represent the Commonwealth in that case when it came to the Supreme Court, and I did so consistent with my ethical obligations.
Your duty is not to make frivolous arguments to the Supreme Court of the United States. And frankly, I question your judgment in what you did in this case, and I question your judgment in choosing to try and perpetuate what is manifestly an injustice to this victim of domestic abuse.
So right off the bat, there's a little confusion, right? Josh Hawley is trying to figure out, hey, did you or did you not argue this case in front of the Supreme Court? And apparently Julia Kobick was a little confused because, well, it wasn't her who brought the case. It was the Attorney General in Massachusetts at the time for which she worked in that office, okay? But she is the one who actually argued it. And I don't know why she had to come up and make these justifications beforehand. It was a simple question. Did you argue this case? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. Now, what makes this interesting, of course, is that the argument she was making before the Supreme Court was something they had already unilaterally ruled on. And of course, that's the idea that because something didn't exist at the time the Second Amendment was written, doesn't mean the Second Amendment doesn't apply to it now. And that's why Josh Hawley starts out his questioning with the First Amendment. Do people have a First Amendment right on the internet? To which, of course, Julia answers in the affirmative. Absolutely 100%, because the First Amendment is for all speech. But the Second Amendment, oh, that's not for all weapons, which of course is the argument she was trying to make. Now, why in the world would this leftist individual want to make the same argument again in front of the Supreme Court? That's because there's always the chance that you have a new member on the Supreme Court that could sway it into a certain vote, because we have to remember this simple fact. Right now, the Supreme Court has decided that, yes, we do in fact have a right to own firearms, but only by a slim margin. Notice in a 5-4 decision in 2008, the District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court affirmed that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess firearms for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense in the home. Okay, so by one vote in the Supreme Court, it was decided that, yes, the Second Amendment is actually a thing. And so what Julia Kobick was hoping for is that somebody would swing. That's why she used that exact same argument. Now, of course, this is all speculation on my part, but it goes back to my original point. The left doesn't view the Constitution as it stands, as it's written, as the law of the land. Instead, they view it as something they can kind of manipulate, right? Oftentimes we call that legislating from the bench. They're not going to take existing law and apply it on whatever scenario is before them, and then, of course, rely on legislators and the president to write new law for things that maybe haven't been covered yet. No, instead, they're going to write new law from the bench that does not exist, and then, of course, rely on that to be precedent until something gets overturned much later on, like, say, Roe v. Wade. And thank goodness that happened, okay? But that's what the left is always banking on. They're going to hope they can slip one by. They're going to hope they can take away your rights because, for whatever reason, they don't want you to be able to defend yourself. And, of course, that brings back to the Gitano argument that Josh Hawley mentions, right? This woman was being terrorized by a big, strong, scary ex-boyfriend, and what did she have? A stun gun, and she used it to scare him off. Right? She didn't shoot him. She didn't maim him. She just used it to scare him off. But apparently in Massachusetts, that was a bridge too far, because we all know that if there's one thing the left really hates, it's a woman being able to defend herself against a man using a weapon. And of course, that comes down to the crux of the entire scenario. The left is anti-Second Amendment because they don't want a general public who's able to take care of themselves, i.e. resist criminals, protect our property, and of course, defend ourselves from an overbearing government. So thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and say hi to your mom for me. Do you like t-shirts? Of course you do. And now you can support the channel by buying an Angry Teacher t-shirt designed by me, Angry Teacher. So if you like America, if you like freedom, if you like liberty, then go ahead and click the link in the description, where all designs, of course, are 100% mother approved. So enjoy yourself and find something you like today.